Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman.
Brad, a minute ago you were talking about an improbable initial coin offering called the Munchies. And seemed absurd, and then Joe, as is wont, tried to outdo you with an even more absurd offering. How many of these have been sold? Who's buying them?
So in calendar year 2017, there was about $3 billion raised through ICOs. I would have guessed that would slow down in 2018 as regulators like the SEC interjected and more proactively called out frauds and scams and, from my opinion, what these actually are. And in many cases, in fact, I think they are securities and should be regulated that way. This year, in 2018, year to date, you've already had $10 billion raised through ICOs. So it's actually increased a lot. And I don't see it slowing down anytime real soon, in part because I think we haven't seen as many regulators get as aggressive as I think they probably should in regulating what is a little bit of a chaotic market.
Yeah, I'm with Brad entirely. I was quoted in the New York Times a while ago as saying these ICOs are the most open and notorious violation of the federal securities laws since the Code of Hammurabi. And why the SEC hasn't been more active, they've only brought 7 actions to this point, is a mystery that I can't explain.
Well, one of the things is, if you try to think about this, these are people who presumably if they could have raised the money for their enterprise with just getting people to send them dollar bills or checks, they would have done that. And yet instead, they're saying to people, I want you to invest in my enterprise, whatever it is, by sending me a cryptocurrency. Which raises the question, why are they asking for the payments in cryptocurrencies rather than in dollars that are easy to go and spend anywhere? And Joe, you have a kind of hypothesis on this.
Oh, Pam, really? If you're going to be conducting a fraud, all right, what do you want people to do? All right, send you small unmarked bills, send you a check. Or would you rather have Bitcoin go to Mikhail Mikhailovich in Minsk?
Well, I understand.
Where when it fails, you're not going to get it back.
Well, but you're not going to get the dollars back either. A check, maybe a credit card, yeah, perhaps. But if somebody sends you dollar bills, there's no way of getting those back either,
Absolutely.
Right?
And from that perspective, you could actually argue that law enforcement prefers that these transactions occur through Bitcoin than in cash. Because one of the things most people don't recognize is Bitcoin is not anonymous. Bitcoin is pseudonymous. Everybody has a public address associated with their participation on the Bitcoin blockchain.
And by public address, you mean something on a computer, not like 47, Bayberry Lane or something.
Well, it's the equivalent of 47. It's a public address. It's a set of numbers, all right, and letters that identify a particular wallet, all right, and it's your public address.
But you don't know where that is. It's metaphorical. Right?
Well, no, you don't.
Right.
But the NSA probably does. But the CIA probably does. But the FBI, there are techniques and there are mathematicians who are actually very, very good
at figuring physically where that.
Precisely. So when people engage in illegal transactions, and they pay for drugs, or for arms or what have you, with boxes of cash, that can be much more difficult for the authorities to track than if you actually are using Bitcoin. Look, for example, at Mueller's indictment of the 13 Russians. Well, they had the Russians' names, and they were able to allege Bitcoin transactions in certain amounts. And, that only happens if you're able to trace the addresses on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Why then, thank you, Joe, why then do people that are, say, kidnappers, we read about in foreign countries, want to get paid in Bitcoin?
Well, that's easy. You see, the problem with kidnapping isn't actually kidnapping the person. That's typically easy. The problem is getting paid, all right? It's a little bit like stealing fancy artwork. How are you going to fence it? So if you kidnap somebody and you want to get paid, and if there's going to be a drop point where you actually have to show up with cash, you run the physical risk of being intercepted at the drop point. With stuff like Bitcoin, with crypto, you eliminate a lot of the physical risk associated with getting paid for the kidnapping. So it actually makes kidnapping a much more profitable proposition. And many Bitcoin whales, many people who have large amounts of Bitcoin are actually very concerned for their personal security.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about blockchain technology with Joe Grundfest and Brad Garlinghouse. And this seems like almost the flip side, Brad, of something you were saying earlier about the frictionless nature of a cryptocurrency. And Joe was saying, exactly.
Well, I think what we're talking about now is, many industries, frankly, start in the darker corners of society, and we start to realize how they can benefit productive use cases. And I think clearly the origins of the crypto community come from a very, anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-bank, around anonymity point of view. And, that's in some ways for what the business Ripple is building, that's a frustrating thing because it takes time and education to explain that there's a lot of misinformation. There are real world use cases, as we talked about earlier, whether it's payment settlement, cross-border, or security settlement, where you can use these technology to have real world positive benefits on economies, on consumer experience, business experience. But there's no doubt that these technologies have been and probably will be continue to be used. And I think the anonymity dynamics are the most vexing. Our view is every account still needs to be KYC'd. That stands for Know Your Client or Know Your Customer. Our view would be, we're not circumventing any of those regulatory frameworks.
So one thing I kind of wondered about and is the international, when you're talking about cross-borders, is there a role for these kinds of technologies and these sorts of assets in countries that don't have reliable central banking system? I mean, I'm thinking about like Venezuela right now, or countries where the central bank is corrupt, or like, is that a place where there's some potential for using these assets?
For sure, and in that context, I would call them currencies. So, when I think about the G20 world, I think, look, fiat currencies work really well, and I don't see a reason that you would, as a consumer, in the next 10 years, be using XRP to make consumer payments. There are economies where the fiat currency is not very, at best, it's a weak currency. And in those contexts, if I were a consumer experiencing hyperinflation, would you rather hold a cryptocurrency or would you rather hold your fiat currency? And in a lot of those cases, you're seeing people take dollars, or not dollars, but take pesos of various sorts and saying, I'd rather hold this because it's a better asset to hold in terms of its potential appreciation and lack of inflation.
Let me maybe close by covering something a lot of people are wondering about, which is, how do we value these assets? I mean, Bitcoin goes from nothing to 15,000 to 6,000. XRP kind of is correlated in rising and fall. Is this a kind of a tulip craze? However useful they are, how do we know what they're worth?
Well, Brad's pointing at me because he doesn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, and I admire Brad for that decision. So the short answer is, who the hell knows? And if I knew how to value this stuff, I'd be very, very, very rich and wouldn't be sitting here talking with you guys. There are all sorts of theories. I don't think a single one of them actually works. I have profound concerns about the reliability of information in the market. This isn't a market like the SEC where we know that we have credible information about secondary market trading and the like. It is very easy to spam the information networks, have false transactions, have false prices and the like. A lot of it is who the hell knows. But if you take simple microeconomics, you've got demand cases and you've got supply cases. The supply is relatively fixed. We know how many units of Bitcoin are supposed to be out there at any one point in time. And then you've got demand cases. Well, people engaged in illegal activity will sometimes want this stuff. People looking to speculate and simply buy because they expect that the value of Bitcoin will increase in the future. They'll want to buy some of this stuff. People in countries where they're worried about hyperinflation, they'll want to buy some of this stuff, and some people want to buy some of the stuff because it gives them something to talk about at a cocktail party.
I'll maybe just add to that briefly. I violently agree with that. The long-term value of any digital asset, I think, is going to be correlated with the utility if it's solving a problem. And I think, as we've discussed, there's a lot of them that either I don't think they ever were intended to solve a problem, or they won't be successful. But I think there will be digital assets that solve a problem, that have utility, and maybe, yes, for some it'll be solving an anonymity problem. Maybe for some it'll be solving a security settlement problem. But I think over a long arc of time, if there's value, if there's utility, then the market will appreciate that.
Well, and I feel just so grateful, Joe, that you haven't made so much money that you couldn't come on our show today.
I have a different view.
Yeah, so thank you, Joe Grundfest, and thanks, Brad Garlinghouse, for coming on our show today. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 120.